So if you guys haven't noticed yet, I think I'm a little bit of a Panasonic fanboy. What up, guys? Welcome back to Stuck in Love Films. I am Sean Rona and I film weddings. Today we are going to be talking about my coveted Panasonic G9, and I do mean coveted. I absolutely adore this camera. I've had this thing for about a year and I am so happy that I got it. It's going to be very interesting because I'm going to talk about, the stuff I like about it, the stuff that I don't like about it, because there are a few weird quirks. I'm a very positive person, so sometimes it's kind of hard for me to talk about things I don't like, but I know that's important too, so I will get into that. And then we're going to talk about like what kind of person actually should get this camera, because I think it's a very small niche. I just happen to be in that niche. So let's jump into the specs, shall we? Now, I know I talked about specs when I first got it, but we're going to kind of go over some of the features that have actually come into real life situation play. So real life situation number 1, 60 frames per second at 4K resolution. This has been absolutely awesome. Not many cameras can do this that are this small. Right now, the Panasonic GH5 and the Panasonic GH5S can do it. So Panasonic's doing something right. And that's a crazy thing to have in a camera this size and at this price point. This was around $1,300 when I got it. The only other cameras that can do this are like the C200 by Canon or the 1DX Mark II. And those are like $6,000 to $8,000 cameras. So I don't know. I think I got something here. The image stabilization that's built inside the body of this camera works so well. Like, it's the best image body stabilization that I've ever seen. And it works pretty well even with lenses that don't have IS. Basically, if you do have a lens that has IS, it's basically like having a gimbal, except you don't have one. Or, the image stabilization has helped a lot because my style when I'm filming weddings is very clean, controlled shots. So having that extra stabilization, even when I'm on a shoulder rig or I'm going handheld, it really, really helps. And it makes the Steadicam and gimbal shots smoother than they would be without it. If you're looking for that smooth, clean motion for your shots, this camera definitely has that. A lot of the time I love using the 4K 60 frames per second for like couples time, because I love slowing those moments down when they're interacting with each other, laughing and having a good time, being cute together, and being able to shoot that at 4K is just, it's sharp as a tack and it's awesome. So this camera has the ability to record slow motion at a variable frame rate setting, and that setting allows you to actually film your shot already in slow motion. Like, the camera processes it, and when you play back your clip, it's already in slow motion. So I can do that from 60 frames per second all the way up to 180 frames per second with this camera, and it's really, really good. I'll tell you a couple times where this comes in handy. When I'm going around getting like detail shots of like rings or the dress or just table settings, I can take this camera handheld and put it in that variable frame rate setting, and I can just move with it very slowly, and in like 2 seconds I have this very smooth rotating shot. This comes in handy so often, and it's very easy to flip through the settings to get to that point on this camera compared to other cameras. So that's the next thing I want to talk about, is the customized dials on this thing. So I've actually set it to where C1 is JPEG photos, C2 is RAW photos, and C3 is very interesting on this camera because it actually has 3 different sub C1, C2, C3s inside that original C3. Basically, I put all of my video settings on this C3 setting, so that way I can go through those 3. So the C1 function in that is actually 4K 24 frames per second, which is mostly what I like to use when, you know, I'm just getting people talking or hanging out or interacting in like a normal way. On C2, I put the 4K at 60 frames per second, so that way I can easily switch to that 4K slow motion for any shots that I want to be a little extra dramatic, or I just think slow motion would be good in this spot. And the C3 is the 180 frames per second at the variable frame rate. So that way I can easily toggle between regular motion, slow motion, and super slow motion at the push of a button. That's one of the things that makes this camera so good and why I love using it so much. It's so ergonomic and it's so intuitive. And I don't know. Like, it's definitely one of my favorite cameras. I can't honestly say that it's the best camera I've ever used, but I really like this thing. So some more function buttons on the outside. This top one here with my finger, I set that to turn on and off zebra stripes. So that way I can see what highlights are blown out immediately. And I can toggle it off if it gets distracting, because sometimes it does. And then the bottom one here, I've actually put to where it will toggle on and off the focus peaking. So that way I can check to see what's in focus. And, you know, if that gets distracting, I can toggle that on and off too. There's also this little function switch right here, which is awesome. And you can set that to whatever you want to. Personally, I set it to turn on and off the image stabilization. I think the times that you would really want to turn that off is if you're going for a more gritty, handheld, shaky feel, or if you're trying to save battery life, because image stabilization does suck up battery life. This camera is already really good with battery, so that doesn't really affect me that much, but if I have to turn it off, it's with the flick of a switch. Alright, so now that I've talked about all of the things I like about it, how it applies to my videography style, let's talk about what I don't like about it. So I was just talking about that this camera can do 180 frames per second in full HD. So this camera was not built for filmmakers. It was built for landscape photographers and wildlife photographers. For some reason, that's who Panasonic was trying to go after, and they got a few, you know, they got those people and they also got me. So I don't know. But basically, in the 180 frames per second mode, it goes into full auto exposure. You have absolutely no control over your shutter speed or your ISO or your aperture unless you're using a manual lens, of course. But basically, if you want to shoot super slow-mo, you sacrifice that control of your camera. For some people, that's not a big deal, but if you're like backlighting something and you're trying to expose it for the image in front of you and not the light behind it, it's going to choose that brightest image to expose for, and then you're gonna end up, you know, silhouetting your subject, which, you know, if you're trying to do that, that's awesome. If you're not trying to do that, it's a pain in the butt. The other quirk about this camera is, because it's not designed for filmmakers, it only shoots in 8-bit video. Now, some of you know what that means. For the people that don't know, don't even worry about it. This camera's awesome for you. But for people that are shooting like a little bit more high-end shoots, they're doing more commercial work, or they just really need a very high quality image, I would say go with the GH5 or something better, because you're not going to get that out of this camera. But the video on this thing is great, and I would still want to use this for weddings. I'll use this for YouTube. I will use it for any kind of online promos. This thing works great. So the last thing that I don't like about this camera is that it does not have Vlog. I know. I understand why it doesn't have Vlog. Vlog's a picture profile that shoots flat like a cinema camera. And because this isn't a cinema camera, you can't get all of that dynamic range out of the camera. This camera honestly doesn't have that much dynamic range. It's about like 10 stops of dynamic range, which isn't a lot. So definitely make sure you expose your image properly and you'll be absolutely fine. I think I've gotten spoiled because I've used some Sony cameras, and even Sony's lower end cameras, like in the consumer range, have the option to put it in an S-Log format, and you get all of that camera's dynamic range out of it. But for some reason, Panasonic decided not to put it in this camera, and it's not built into the GH5. You still have to order it as a separate transaction and add it to the camera. The other thing about this camera is it has great battery life. It has better battery life than the GH4 and the GH5, which is weird to me. The battery lasts forever, so I don't honestly think you need a battery grip, but it's definitely a good accessory if you are shooting all day. It'll double your battery life, and since it's already good, it's a decent purchase. Because it's a micro four thirds sensor, you're gonna want to buy a speed booster, especially if you're in any kind of low light situations. And that will help you adapt, full frame glass to the camera and be able to let in more light, take away a little bit of that crop factor, and you will get really good images out of it. That's what I do. Or you could just buy some really fast micro four thirds glass, which also works. But I've gone the speed booster route. So while we're on that subject, let's talk about how well it does in low light. So I've shot quite a few projects on this, and it's pretty good in low light. I know what you're thinking, it's not a full frame camera, it's not the A7S II. I'm not talking about, is it the king of low light? No. Like A7S II, nothing was really gonna touch that. GH5S does really well in low light. Those guys are in like their own league. For a camera that has such a small sensor size, it does a decent job pushing its ISO without getting too noisy. Compared to cameras that I've had in the past, other cameras that I've worked with, like even the 70D or the T3i, things like that, older Panasonic cameras, this thing processes much better. With the GH4, I couldn't really go past 800 comfortably, and even that was pushing it. The shadows would get very noisy, and the image, I had a lot of noise issues with that camera. But this camera, it's only when you go past 3200 that you really start seeing noise that's going to bother you. So the last thing that I want to talk about is who this camera is actually for. Is it for a photographer? Is it for a videographer? I'm not really sure. It was targeted towards photographers, but it has really good video qualities. So I think that the person this is geared towards is somebody who started out in the Panasonic family. So maybe your first camera was a GH2, or maybe it was a GX7. I don't know. But if you're, one of those people and you're looking to upgrade to a newer Panasonic camera, this might actually be something that would be good for you, especially if you dabble in video, because it has amazing video features for what it is. If you're like a filmmaker and you're hardcore into video, I think the GH5 is still a better camera. But the thing about that is there are some people that will spend as much money as they want on a GH5 and all of its accessories, but to make it into a beefy, beastie camera. But if you're just doing a lot of YouTube stuff and online videos, and you're more of a run and gun kind of person, and you don't need all of the extra rig stuff, and maybe you don't want to spend $2,000 on a GH5, and even used it's $1,500, I would probably go after the G9 because it has almost as good video specs, but you're not spending as much money. This you can get new for $1,100, so even if you find one used, you can probably find a deal for $900. So you'll end up saving a few $100s and being able to spend that on like the right lenses for it. So I'd say if you meet one of those two criteria, this is probably the camera that you would really like. Well, that's our video for today, guys. If you are interested in the Panasonic G9, I will include a link to it in the description below, as well as to some of its accessories. If you guys have any questions at all, please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will answer them as soon as I can. If you guys like this video, hit that like button. It does help. And if you want to be a part of this channel, please hit that subscribe button. And as always, it's not about the gear or the camera. It's about what you can do with it. I'll see you guys next time.